Hey, everybody, welcome to the Whole Church Podcast, possibly your favorite church unity podcast. You're thinking, wait, what? There wasn't a verse. This is the wrong day. That's because this is a bonus episode. I had the month booked, basically, and still desperately needed to talk to one of my favorite recent guests, Thomas J. Ord, the author of a ton of things, but today we're talking about his newest book, The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Omnipotence. It's always fun when you have people you get along with and respect that you know are smarter than you, that you're still like, I don't know if I agree with you. It's so much fun to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming back. Good to have you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Oh yeah, me too. And because I did this really weird, we're recording on the wrong day. Not only are you receiving the episode on the wrong day, we also recorded on the different day than usual. So the greatest co-host of all time could not make it. But in his lieu, he selected among all men the finest that he could find. And that was Christian Ashley, sent from Tiberius himself. How's it going, Christian?
All right. I'm used to being second best.
You know, that's my motto. Second is good enough. I'm kidding. We love Christian. Christian is just as good as TJ in many ways. Maybe just not as a co-host. Maybe he was just meant to be a host. I don't know. Anyway, today we're discussing the book, like I already mentioned. Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to figure out what to do from here because TJ usually speaks up here, but Christian's TJ, so I'm going to shut up.
Okay. Yeah, guys. So as things go on, the convention is about to happen. Please, if you get a chance, check out our website for the convention to see what we're doing. All the things we're going to be doing there are going to be a ton of fun. We know it's just going to be a lot of fun. I mean, how many words can I put to say that? Like, I'm so looking forward to this, to have a week off, to spend time with friends, some of whom I've never met before in person. It's going to be a blast. Head there.
Shout out to Brandon Knight.
Absolutely. Him and Will, first time I meet them in person, it's going to be just so great. As well, guys, we just started up, as you've heard probably before, we have started up the Annisal Ministries podcasting network. This has been something we've been working on for a little bit. Josh and I have been talking about it. There's a lot of good shows on there. We just added the newest show as of this recording. What was it, 2 days ago?
Yeah.
Yes, and I have already listened through all of them because they're very short. Don't always agree with everything said there, but I really appreciate what is being said. So if you want something that's a little outside your comfort zone, I'd suggest, oh gosh, what is his name?
The Foul-Mouthed Preacher.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that podcast is the Bible After Hours. It's a lot of fun. I help a lot with that show, and it's challenging because I'm like, hey, I don't agree with all this, but you know, I do a little bit of voice acting, I do a little bit of different things for them, and I'm like, you know what, I'll help you as much as I can. That being said, I'm usually really specific when I share that one. I'm like, hey guys, if you want to hear something that that's really good, but maybe challenging to people who believe like me, you know, you try to find like respectful ways to like share. But yeah, part of the network, because we fully support what he's doing and his heart behind everything. He wants to stay anonymous, but you know who you are. I know you listen to this, and I love you, bro. Okay, so that being said, we're going to jump into my favorite form of church unity. It's a great, deep spiritual practice that everybody loves so much. It's not just for me, I promise. It might be. But it is silliness because it's just impossible to stay divided when you're being as goofy as I am about to be. No matter how many times our silly question has sparked a debate and arguments, I will still say that it is unity engendering. Today's question is, who is your favorite intentionally fictional god? In comics, cartoons, etc. I just put it that way because, you know, some people don't necessarily believe in God and think our God's, you know, fictional. So I just added that intentional word in there. But, you know, if there's a God you like from like a cartoon, from a comic book, from a TV series, video game series, anything like that, now's the time to bring it up. Ryan Doze is listening right now, screaming Thor over and over. But we can't hear you, Ryan. I'm sorry.
I'm also catching up with that one right now. Across the Bifrost.
Yeah,
very good.
Yeah. He's a great guy. So much fun. We'll answer first. Give you time to think about it. Do you prefer Dr. Ord? I forget.
Tom is fine.
Tom. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to go first. This one's honestly really difficult because there are actually just a ton of great answers to this. If we're specifically talking about, this is like a really like weird, no one's going to remember this. If we're talking about PlayStation All-Stars specifically, then Zeus would be my favorite. I'm really good at it. That's just like PlayStation's version of Smash Bros. If we're talking like comics and stuff, oh, that is, it is a challenge. I'm thinking installing right now.
I've got one. I can jump in.
Okay, you go ahead. You go ahead.
My
It might
mind
help.
went to an old movie called Bruce Almighty, in which
Ooh,
Jim
yeah.
Carrey is
Yeah, that's a
engaging
fun
with
one.
Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman plays the God character there.
Yeah.
And I think that's especially appropriate since we're going to talk about omnipotence, and that movie title assumes God has a certain kind of power.
That's true. That's true. Christian, do you have anything while I'm like struggling here?
Well, I have several answers because Dr. Ord, Tom, what I always do here is I cheat and have multiple answers for things
Okay, smart
because,
man.
yeah, that's what the people love about me, I'm sure. Yeah, I have 4 answers. I'm only going to focus on 2. And Josh, real quick, how far are you into the Dresden Files series right now? I know you mentioned you were listening to the audiobooks.
I'm like 2 books in. I'm
Okay, I won't say one of them then.
No,
We're down
go
to
ahead.
3.
Go ahead. I don't care.
Okay. Odin from the Dresden Files series. Also, because he's not only Odin, he's also Santa Claus. And which, if you look at your mythology, sometimes that aligns. Very good. I also chose from Marvel Hercules because I love.
I thought about that one. Yeah.
This brash braggart who just continually causes problems for himself, but also is continuing to try and help people and do good things. And then my third one was Talos from the Elder Scrolls, who is a human who became a god. And I just find a lot of irony in the fact that I always play as a high elf dragonborn for Skyrim who hates the Thalmor and the Stormcloaks but worships Talos. It just brings a lot of joy to my heart that that's a thing.
I like being the reptile species. I don't remember
the Argonians.
Yeah. Okay.
My actual answer. My actual answer.
There are so many answers.
I know. That's how I cheat, Josh. That's what I do.
You're killing me.
I chose not. There's a character named Godzilla, but he himself is not a god. But there is a god appearing in the 70s films, and that is our gracious overlord, our beetle cockroach hybrid, Megalon, worshipped by the Seatopians, teaming up with Gigan, one of my favorite kaiju of all time. Megalon is my favorite god in all of fiction.
Man, the thing is, like, I just love fictional religions a lot, and I know that's weird. I just really enjoy this topic, so it's difficult. It feels like it's wrong not to mention one of the God of War gods. Because my favorite Disney movie is Hercules, it's really hard not to say that. I'm going through comics. There's all the new gods in DC and all that. There's Loki. Everybody loves Loki. I'm going to do a pick that literally no one else, well, there's like 3 other people could pick. Back in high school and some of college, we made up our own role-playing game. I consulted a few different professors. We built an entire system that involved what religions would eventually become one day, and then also what would human bodies eventually evolve into one day. And we played that. And one of the religions in this made-up world had a god that was the White Lion. I really liked him because his appearance made it seem like he was going to be pure and all-powerful and all these things. And yet what he ended up being was this angry god that kind of feigned all power, which is funny because of today's topic. So yeah, I was like, I'm going to go with that and just have to explain to people what I'm talking about. This might be our longest silly question segment. I'm sorry, guys.
It's my fault.
With that, Dr. Ord, we are here, Tom, to discuss your book. But first, let's get into some of the basics. I'm stealing Christian's part, so he's going to steal my next one. What's your most recent book about? We mentioned The Death of Omnipotence and The Birth of Omnipotence, which is one of those, man, that's a big, triggering, eye-catching title. What inspired this one, and where can listeners go to learn more about it and pick up a copy?
Well, some people give titles of books and they try to shock you. They don't really mean what the title says. My title says The Death of Omnipotence. I really mean it. I think omnipotence is dead, or at least it should be. We should stop calling God omnipotent. If by that we mean God is all powerful, can do anything, or can control others in creation. And this book lays out in 4 chapters, kind of like 4 movements of a symphony, the reasons we should reject omnipotence, but then offers a constructive replacement. I've written books in the past suggesting that God can't control others. In fact, one has the provocative title, God Can't. And this book, I wanted to also propose an alternative, a way in which we can talk about God's power. So that's what this book is about. You can find it on all, your usual online booksellers.
Hmm. Yeah, this is just a quick side note. One of the most aggravating things when a book is only deconstructive that just irks me.
Yeah.
One of my favorite authors, actually, Frank Viola, he writes Pagan Christianity.
Yeah.
Fantastic book, completely deconstructs a lot of the things we think should be in church, and turns out they just absolutely shouldn't be. And he's like, "Oh, come back next time, and I'll do the reconstruction book." And I was like, "Okay, I guess I can wait." It was really aggravating. And then the reconstruction book for me fell a little flat compared to the predecessor. I was like, I don't like what you replaced it with as much as your argument for deconstruction, but I also don't
Yep.
want to be left there.
Yep.
So even though love him as an author, respect the guy, it's also just kind of like, man, this is hmm. But you have the omnipotence thing. It was a real challenge for me. I'm going to throw out a little cushion for people first. I still don't fully agree with where Tom's at, but whenever he kind of explains a lot of how people do this omnipotence, but God can't create something God can't lift, or omnipotence, but God can't be anything but love. He was like, well, he can't do those things. I was like, okay, I see what he's saying. There is a lot of these people who say omnipotence that do God can do everything but. So that's kind of where I was like, okay, that's the
Yeah.
sweet spot of where I like to keep the conversation. I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's actually all of chapter 2. It's looking philosophically at people who've said God is omnipotent, but, and they give these exceptions, these provisos, these qualifications. In fact, that chapter is called Omnipotence Dies a Death of a Thousand Qualifications. And when I say people qualify omnipotent, I mean not just progressive people, but conservative people. Some of the most conservative theologians in Christian history have added all
Yeah.
these things that God can't do, like make 1 + 1 = 367, or stop existing, or tell a lie, or, et cetera, et cetera. There's literally, if we went one by one, we could come up with millions, even billions, if we took the time of things that God can't do. Some of those things, in fact, you and I can do. Like, for instance, tell a lie. You and I can tell a lie, but God can't. Um, so that's a big part of my argument for why omnipotence is dead.
Hmm. I have so much to say that, but I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait because I know Christian is begging to do his next part.
It's fine. We'll get there eventually. So, Tom, how would you say that the reception has been to this book so far?
It's been surprisingly positive. The book's only been out in the world maybe 3 weeks, four, maybe. I don't know. I've kind of lost track of time here. Um, and the reviews are almost all positive, in part because people who bought it are people who've read my past work, and so it's even though there's new ideas here, it's not a shock to most of them.
Mhm.
So once more people get a chance to read it, then I suspect I'll see more negative reviews. But I think what
Yeah,
I think
fair.
what kind of surprises most people, especially people like me who come from an evangelical background, is my first chapter in which I address the biblical issues.
Mhm.
That's a big shocker to people.
Yeah. Also, for those wondering, we have interviewed Tom before. I will have that link down below in the show notes if you kind of want to know just more about his history and some of the other background stuff that he mentions here.
And I'll say, as far as other hosts are concerned for systematic ecology, I was just re-listening to the My Hero Academia episode we did, and I'm fairly certain Nick mentioned that he had just received your book. One of our other co-hosts there,
Mm-hmm.
so you have
Yeah.
at least one other fan here.
Yeah.
Good, good.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a big fan. I have not got this book yet, just for for clarity's sake, because I had really only started reading your work probably was it back January, December, something like that. So it's like there's a lot of books to catch up on.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
understand. There's my reading list is pretty high.
Yeah, yeah, and I probably won't read all of them if I'm be honest. Particularly, I'm actually I'm right now. I'm on the verge of deciding whether or not I want to read. It was another one you recently did. It was with your daughter.
Oh,
The
why the
Nazarene
Church
Church
of the
should be.
Nazarene? Yeah,
Yeah,
why it should be fully LGBTQ plus affirming.
yeah, I'm on the border because I'm really interested in the arguments, but also I'm not Nazarene. I'm like,
Yeah.
hey, also.
Oh, the arguments will apply to most denominations, most groups. You don't have to be Nazarene to appreciate it.
Wow, it must
Well,
be so
that is
nice to
good to
have
know.
a book list that's not required by the classes you're in right now.
Yeah, yeah. So usually, the way these shows work for the Whole Church podcast, if you haven't listened before, usually I have an outline. We ask a bunch of specific questions to get to know the guest a little bit better, to know their beliefs, to know what they're doing, and we kind of just get to know them. Hey, how do we have unity? Today, I wanted to do a little bit different and do a little bit more pushback, a little bit more conversational because I know that Tom is able to do that. I've heard him
Good.
on other podcasts. I'm like, hey, let's have just a
Yeah.
really kind of a more raw, real conversation about the topic of this book, omnipotence. So earlier you were talking about God can't, and I guess my first question to kind of kick this part of the conversation off, which I'm inviting Christian into. Christian, just whatever pops in your head, say it, no matter how awful. Um,
Is it
this is going to
bad? Do
be a
you
fun one.
expect that out of me?
Yeah. No. What I was going to ask though is, instead of getting rid of omnipotence, why wouldn't we work on defining it better? If that makes sense. Like,
Mm.
why can't we say that it's not about power as much as, God could physically just change math, but he won't just because he won't. Like, why do we have to get rid of omnipotence? I guess is sort of the question.
Yeah, there's quite a few reasons why I think we ought to get rid of it. One of them we've already mentioned, and that is just philosophically untenable in the sense of having to qualify what we mean every time we say the word if we want to be clear. And people have been doing that for centuries. But if if I went around saying the All Church podcast was the greatest podcast in the interwebs,
Correct.
but then I started pointing out all the flaws, all the things that I don't like. After a while, people will say, well, how is it the greatest if it's got all these flaws, right? And so
Yeah.
that's what's happened with this word omnipotent. We've said God can do anything, and then we've qualified it over and over. But I think the thing that first got me thinking about why we should scrap omnipotence wasn't philosophical. It also wasn't biblical. It was experiential. It was the questions of evil. If we say God can do anything, but God is choosing not to prevent evil, I suspect that means we're not portraying God as a perfectly loving person.
Hmm.
Suppose my grandson and my granddaughter are over at my house, and my granddaughter starts to choke my grandson and is actually going to choke the life out of him and kill him. And I've got the ability to intervene and rescue him. But suppose I say, I'm not going to cause this. I'm just going to allow this killing. I mean, I can do whatever I want here, and I'm not the one doing the killing, but I'm just going to allow it. Then you're not going to call me a loving grandfather. If we say God has the power to prevent evil but chooses not to, I don't think we should call this God loving. So there's good reasons in terms of our experience of evil to reject the idea that God is omnipotent in the sense of three senses. In the sense of God can do anything, I don't think that's true. In the sense that God exerts all the power in the universe, I don't think that's true. And the big one, I don't think God can control others and creation. So God's not omnipotent in those three senses.
I think for me, it's probably just more of a semantic thing that I get hung up on. I think most of my disagreement is there. So I'm going to try to put that aside because this isn't
Okay.
the whole linguistic podcast. So I'm going to try to put that aside and kind of focus more in what you're actually talking about. I do find some of your reasoning compelling when it comes to, especially that first thing of a loving God situation and the problem of evil, thinking about that specifically.
Yeah.
Um, Especially because of how often I see that solved poorly if that makes sense, of how
Sure.
many churches and people I know who kind of do, well, a loving God wouldn't let you get ran over by a car if you were to run in the street. That's the one I hear a lot. A parent wouldn't let their
Yeah.
kid just run the car, and that's why God punishes us. And I'm like, okay, I don't like
Yeah.
that as much, because then it also
No.
gets into like they'll take that and use it. Well, that's why you're poor off financially. That's why this happened to
Right.
you. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's
I'm not
the Bible
advocating that.
doesn't support that at all.
Yeah.
What's happening here? Yeah.
No,
So
that doesn't make sense.
yeah, so I do find it compelling because it keeps us from that at least.
Okay.
I think I personally would probably take it more of a kind of to do the opposite, and I hate to do that, to kind of reverse the burden of proof, so to speak. But I'm thinking
Yeah.
more of like, I also just, which I think you also said this, I hate the idea of a controlling God.
Right.
So if I'm starting with, and I guess this is what you're challenging is the premise, but for me, the premise is, God is all powerful. And then I'm like, well, I don't like this idea that God's just letting people kill each other, but I also don't like the idea of God taking away free will, because we would also say that that's not loving.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
I
I'm
see
with
yours
you.
as like as the third way out. And for me, and I know you, what's funny, you criticize this a lot, but for me, I'm like, I like there kind of being this mystery of the divine where I don't fully get it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I
I
also,
criticize that. You're right.
yeah, but
Well,
I like,
let me take another
okay,
tack.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Let me start with the premise that you want to affirm that God is all powerful. I think that's the word you used, all powerful. And let's ask, why would you want to do that? Now, if you're like most Christians, you'll probably say, well, because that's the way the Bible describes God. One of the things I do in this book is I show readers that that's simply not the case. If we read the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, every time we see the word God Almighty, it's a mistranslation of one of two Hebrew words. One of those words is Shaddai, which means breasts or mountains. Excuse me. The other one is the word Sabaoth, which means armies, hosts, councils, groups.
Mhm.
Those two words get translated as the word Pantocrator in the Greek Septuagint in the third and fourth centuries. Pantocrator means something like all holding. That word Pantocrator ends up in the New Testament only 10 times. And then it gets translated as omnipotent by Jerome in the, I think, 6th century or something. Anyhow, my point is
Mhm.
this. Every time you see the word almighty in the Bible, you're not seeing in the original languages don't mean almighty. So if it's a biblical argument, I'm saying there's no place in scripture for it. Now, some people will say to me, okay, maybe the word omnipotent or almighty or all powerful or whatever, maybe the word's not there, but the idea is there. Well, if the first notion of omnipotent means God exerts all the power, it seems very obvious to me that that's not the case in Scripture. I mean, not only do creatures exert power, sometimes they exert power in ways that are sinful that God doesn't want. If you mean by that that God can do anything, there are a couple of biblical passages that kind of sound like that. In the New Testament, a couple of times, maybe three times, we hear something like, with humans, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible.
Mhm.
But I address that in the book by noting that there are dozens of instances in scriptures in which the writers say God can't do things. God can't be tempted. God can't grow tired. God can't deny himself. God can't, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I don't think the biblical witness gives us a good reason to think God is all powerful in that sense.
Mhm.
And then the third one, which I think is the one that is probably the most interesting to people, is does the Bible explicitly say or imply God controlled creatures or creation? I think lots of Christians, even scholars, have come to the text assuming God has that ability and then read it into the stories, but nowhere in the entire Bible does it explicitly say God alone brought about these results. So, if your premise is that I have to believe God is omnipotent, almighty, all powerful, because that's what the Bible requires, I'm arguing in the first chapter of this book that the Bible does not require that. What do you think of that?
Hmm. I Yes, and I hate being that guy. I think all of that's true from what I tell. I don't think it says Almighty or says any of that. I'm iffy about the control thing just because I haven't looked through the Bible just for that thing, and
Sure.
it always feels weird to be like, that's definitely not in this 2,000-page book, because I'm like, man,
Yeah.
so easy to think I could have missed something.
Sometimes I'm at conferences and I'll offer $1,000 to anybody in the audience who can find me an example. And they'll come up to me with like Pharaoh hardening or God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And I'll say, no, that doesn't explicitly say God controlled. In fact, several times Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And who's to say that hardening means control? We just made
Yeah.
that leap. Or
God
they'll say
confirmed Pharaoh's heart.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Or they'll
yeah.
say, well, what about the creation of the universe? And I'll say, right there at the beginning, there's something that the Spirit hovers over. Or they'll say, the resurrection of Jesus. And I'll say, no, there's nothing explicitly says God alone brought that about. So, yeah, you may, I'm putting you on the spot when I say what
Mm.
I'm saying,
Oh yeah,
but I've put lots of people on the spot. And so far, no one has come up with anything.
yeah. I'm gonna give Christian a chance. Did you have anything biblically that you wanted to bring up before I
About
take it
this in
anywhere
particular,
else?
no, I was not prepared for that, so that's on me. I mean, in
Well,
general, I'm
let me
trying to
then
put.
throw out. Can I throw out one of the common examples in? I
Go
mean,
for it.
a lot
Yeah.
of people think that in order to account for miracles in the Bible, you have to have a controlling God. And one of the arguments I make in this book is that that's not the case, that the miracles can happen because creation cooperated with God, or in the case of inanimate matter like water, the conditions of creation can be conducive for the miracle to occur. And the upside of this argument, well, one of the upsides, is that then it also helps us to solve this question of why doesn't God do more miracles?
Mhm.
Like, why is it that when we go to church and pray for somebody's cancer, oftentimes they're not healed? If
Mhm.
God can up and single handedly do something and God's perfectly loving, then why doesn't God heal people? And of course, you all know the usual answer is it's a mystery. God's trying to teach them a lesson, all that kind of stuff that I don't find satisfying at all. So, this way of thinking about miracles as involving some kind of creaturely cooperation at some
Mhm.
level of complexity, or the inanimate conditions of creation being conducive, actually can account for miracles and account for why there aren't miracles when we want them.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm going to try and put all these thoughts I'm having into words.
Okay.
Yeah,
I love
because
it.
Yeah.
I've been all over the place during this conversation. I want to say this, but you said something else, and then Josh said something. It's like, man, maybe I'll get back to those thoughts. Who knows?
Yeah.
It's like I want to start under the premise is that we are working under a human word that is heavily flawed by the fact that we are human when it
Mhm.
comes to the Almighty, to when it comes to omnipotence. So I don't.
The whole
God
linguistic
never.
podcast.
Yeah, God has never used the word omnipotent, as far as I'm aware. I'm pretty sure there's not in Scripture to describe Himself. So we have attributed that to Him. Now, for me, I don't think it's that list of, well, how do you go from this all powerful to having no power like us, comparatively speaking, to where God obviously has way more than us. I don't know if there's exactly a word for that, so that's the best we've got. But I think I would still use it to describe God in the fact that He is working within the rules that He created, and that there's no other being out there that can make rules where there are limitations to those rules. Can God create a rock heavier than Himself than He can't lift? Can God, make a burrito so hot that He Himself couldn't eat it? All these joke answers you get sent out. It's like, yeah, well, that confirms that God is working within the rules that He created. So that shows me His power, His omnipotence in that way. And once again, omnipotence, we've all figured out, is probably a very terrible word to use because it doesn't mean what we think it means. So
I love it. That's a good Princess Bride line right there.
Yeah. 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 I'm just waiting on Tom to tell you he has come up with a new word.
and actually, I do
Yeah,
like omnipotence. The
omnipotence
idea,
is how I say it, but yeah,
yeah, yeah, 'cause isn't it AMI potence?
yeah,
Okay,
that's right.
Challenge round. Say
Omnipotence.
it differently each time.
yeah, say it again. How you say it, Tom?
I say it omnipotence.
Omnipotence. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
Uh,
Perfect.
and I like the idea behind that is that of God being loving towards us, coming from those words used there. But at the end of the day, I disagree with the idea of God not being able to, or excuse me, not being loving in that he allows bad things to happen. In the fact that we live in a sin-filled world. And what is that verse from Peter? First or second, I can never
Just
remember
summarize it.
verses. Yeah. Of,
Okay,
he
can I
allows those
respond
things
to
to
that?
happen. Yeah. He allows these things to happen for people to come to repentance. So go ahead.
All right. So first, I want to begin with what I agree with. I agree that there's never going to be the perfect word. And omnipotence, my alternative, amnipotence, is not perfect either. Words are never going to be perfect. So I'm with you there. Now, let me tell you how I disagree with you.
Go for it.
Most Christian theologians, including most conservative Christian theologians and philosophers, would say that there are rules, to use your language, that God didn't make up, that God is subject to. We would say those rules come from God's nature, and God didn't create God's own nature. In the philosophical language, it's all about Platonic forms and all this sort of stuff. But anyway, I won't go nerdy in that direction. I'll just say,
Sounds
maybe
fun though.
some people will say God made up the laws of nature, but there are other laws like the laws of logic or the laws of mathematics or the laws of God's own nature that even the most conservative philosophical theologians would say God didn't make those up. They're somehow in God everlastingly. But my more important point is the second one. Your approach has the liability, I think, of you having to look a rape victim in the eye and say, God could have stopped what happened to you, but chose to allow it.
Yes.
I get the opportunity to look that same person in the eye and say, nope, God didn't cause it. God didn't permit it. God didn't allow it. God was with you, trying to work with you and you're the perpetrator to stop it, but God didn't allow something. And I tell you, I personally think that's a huge advantage to my view.
That's perfectly fair. Oh, sorry. Did I interrupt you?
No, no, that was yeah.
Okay.
I'm not attacking. I'm just saying that's
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think of these
Yeah.
things. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a big advantage.
No,
Okay.
I get that completely. I mean, I don't like the fact, I don't think anyone here would say that there's still child slavery and sexual slavery
Yeah.
rampant throughout the world. That, there are rape victims out there in the world, that there are, these flatworms that can just enter a person's body and cause irreparable damage to them. Like, I have to
Yeah.
wrestle with that every single day. Like, God allows that to happen in my point of view. Like, why is that? How could a loving God do that? And at the end of the day, it's like, I have a very limited perspective is where I'm
Yeah.
coming from. So why does God allow it? My answer is I don't know. I think we would all say I don't know, but there is something that's
Yeah.
going
I
to
don't
be
want to
done that is going to bring glory to him.
Yeah, I don't want to come
Ugh.
across as like having all the
Ugh.
answers. So
Oh yeah,
let me
yes.
also say
Oh
that
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm proposing a model of thinking about God that I'm not certain is right. So I
Yes.
don't
Yeah.
know it, but I
Yeah.
am saying this model has some advantages. I think that your model doesn't. Now,
Mhm.
what most people say in response to me is they'll say, "Oh, so your God's not in control? Must be a wimp." Must be up on Mars eating popcorn, watching us all suffer. Your God's
Well,
an impotent God. And that's why in the last chapter, I coined this word amnipotent to try to talk about God being the most powerful being in the entire universe and yet being uncontrolling.
Hmm. So I got like I've been backloading a bunch of thoughts. So
Good.
I'm gonna unleash a
I
bunch at
think we all
once,
have.
and then I'm
Christian
gonna
life
throw it
is
to you
going
at
at
the
it
end.
here.
So
Yeah.
first, in response to some of the things said so far, before I throw out my whole new thing, I want to say, I personally really feel like all Christians. So I'm not talking about either of you specifically. I think we all do this thing where we over personify God as if, oh, he's just like a parent preventing a child from danger. Like, well, he's not though, because he's not human. He's spirit, and I don't think we fully grasp what that means. And I don't say I have a good answer to that. I do think that's one issue. I think there's another issue of time, assuming that God relates to time the same way as us, as if he could stop it in that moment instead of being outside of time. And who we don't have the ability to comprehend what it's like to be outside of time, which I'm not saying God is outside of time. What I'm saying is I don't think we fully grasp how God relates to time, especially with all the scientific advances where we know that time really kind of depends on mass and gravity and all these other things. And is God affected by these things? I don't know. I don't know what a spirit is. So I think that's another part of the equation that really makes these conversations difficult. Not that it's in favor or against some of what we're saying here, but it's one of those fun reminders of we're talking about God in this way as if he is super personified and constrained to time when I'm not convinced he is.
Yeah. Can I respond to that before you get to the new
Yes,
stuff?
yes.
I think you're exactly right. I think we all have assumptions about God's relation to time, God's similarity or dissimilarity to us. I've done a lot of the work to sort of lay out my view on those things. I do think God acts through time. I do think God is universal without a localized body and yet relational. But you're exactly right. All those kinds of issues are going to come into play. And if you're going to give a good model that addresses all the facets of the question, I think you have to come to some kind of conclusion on those kinds of issues. And I've tried to do that in some of my writings.
Yeah, man. So I love that answer. My whole new thing, though, because I think you've kind of presented your argument against omnipotence. I kind of want to present why I think of omnipotence and let you respond to that instead of us just responding to your beliefs. And I hope you don't feel like we're ganging up on you or anything.
No,
It's so
definitely
intimidating.
not.
Good. Yes, yes. Christian is the most intimidating man on earth. I don't know why Tiberius chose. um,
Uh,
so for me, I think of, and this is going to excite some Methodist followers and maybe upset some who don't believe experience should account for anything. In my experience of salvation, it was this true, meaningful moment for me where I kind of feel like I reached some kind of enlightenment. My lifestyle changed. I felt this burden of guilt kind of drop off, all of those things. That was part of my experience. So I'm starting there, and I know that's aggravating people that I'm starting there and not the Bible or somewhere, but just hang on.
hey,
Um,
I'm totally with you there. That's perfectly fine with me.
I'm
cool.
used to you. It's fine.
I so for me, I have to believe this thing of salvation is real. It seems as though these ideas of sin and things that were burdening me, even the law, I want to point out, as far as my beliefs concerned, salvation releases us from that as well, and guilt. All those things also have to be real for salvation to be real for me. And the way I view salvation is it is reliant on Jesus in some way. I've yet to kind of decide, I'm not a huge fan of penal substitution, but I'm like, I don't know which one I am a fan of, but I don't think it's that quite. Maybe. I don't know. Asterisk mark, get to that later. But in order for salvation to make sense for me, then Jesus, who in my belief is God, he had to have the power to intervene in that way. And I think for me, it kind of goes into, if you're not all powerful, if you're able to change your mind, which I know is a lot of your stuff is about the Bible verses that God changed his mind. If he's able to literally change his mind, I'm like, man, why couldn't he have just changed his mind? I could have been born with this salvation experience, all these things. Like, why did salvation need to happen? Why did Jesus need to happen if God isn't all powerful? If he's able to just not do that, which is funny because I'm basically saying because of my belief of him being all powerful, he can't not do that. So it's kind of
That's what I'm saying.
ironic given the context
Thinking
of
to
the
myself,
argument.
you're
Yeah.
making my argument here.
But
Yeah, but
then I guess that begs the question of why couldn't he have just changed his mind then? Why did salvation need to happen?
well, because changing God's mind didn't mean that you got salvation. Because as a Methodist, assuming you kind of follow the general Wesleyan soteriology,
Yeah, it's funny. I'm
salvation.
Lutheran. I just really like the quadrilateral.
Okay. All right. Well, then this is not going to apply. But if you were Wesleyan, you would say God doesn't save you without your cooperation. Salvation always includes some kind of creaturely response to God. In the Methodist tradition, it's all about prevenient grace, the idea that God acts first and empowers a response. So salvation would not be some omnipotent move by God by which you're a passive, pawn and everything is done to you. You'd have to cooperate in some way. I tell you, I know I'm biased here, but it seems like the usual way salvation is talked about in Scripture. that we have to do some believing, we have to do some repenting, we have to have some faith, we have to do,
Mm-hmm.
there's some action on our part that's part of the salvific process.
Yeah. Okay. I think. Sorry, your answer is kind of helping me dissect my own thought process a little bit
Good.
better,
Okay.
which is part of the point of this. This is fun. Um,
Yes,
I think part of it is in my mind, God has the power to save me because he created all things. So I am part of this overarching creation narrative, and that gives God power over all things that are created. Um, so my question is not going to be two-part of, A, do you, well, let's just start there. Do you
that's a
think
great
God
place to
created all
start.
things? What did God create?
I think God is the creator of all things, but never, ever, at the beginning and now, ever single handedly. God's creating was always in relation to what God had previously created, and that creating is everlasting. I talk about that in one part of this particular book, but I've talked about in others. So I think you're right. If you think that God once was all alone and then created the universe out of absolutely nothing, then that God seems to have the kind of omnipotent power that God could just up and save whoever God wants to save. And if this God is loving, God to save everybody. And if the God is truly loving, God to get rid of all evil. But you and I don't live in a world with all evil, without evil, I should say. So maybe we should rethink this idea that God's omnipotent, including rethink that there was a time in which God existed all alone and then created the world out of nothing.
Hmm. This is the fun of debating people smarter than you. It's so much fun. um, okay. So, in your belief, then, is what you're saying is there was never a time where God was all alone.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't that
See
a
that
wild
that's a
idea?
whole new premise then. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Yes.
exactly. Yeah.
so what were the first things then? Now we're getting into that weird time thing.
That's like asking what was the first moment of God's life? There was
Okay,
no
fair
first
enough.
moment if you're yeah.
Yeah.
So if God has always been creating. Now I can say there's a first moment in the life of our universe. I
Mhm.
can believe in the Big Bang. I just think there was something prior to our universe, probably the chaos of a previous universe. But the basic notion is God is everlastingly creating moment by moment in relation to what God previously created. And that's going to be important not only for the omnipotent stuff, but working through these questions of evil that we've been working through. And like you rightly said, helping us to think about salvation, whether or not God requires our cooperation or God could just snap a finger and everybody goes to heaven.
Hmm. Mhm. Man. Sorry, there's just so much. It's so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I am, this is just my free plug of the episode. I am starting another podcast myself that's going to be dummy for theology, and we're just going to go over different theological ideas. So the idea of time and stuff really intrigues me, especially
Good.
that the Bible kind of starts with in the beginning God was in the beginning, as in not creating the beginning. So that's
Right.
always kind of an interesting, man, the Bible starts really weirdly when you think about it. And it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that he didn't create the beginning, but that's not what it says.
I think the NRSV says, in the beginning, when God was creating the heavens and the earth, the Spirit hovered over the deep,
Ooh,
which is a
fun.
formless void. There's something there even at the beginning of our universe. That's not a God all alone creating out of nothing.
Man.
Yeah, I would say personally, I don't like the idea of there being a universe before ours because that means that Galactus is canon to our universe because that's his origin, and I'd rather that didn't be a thing because I don't think we have the Fantastic Four around to save us.
Oh man. Well, little do you know. No,
I love it.
no, I also just watching the people who do that kind of the science of looking into the Big Bang and how all those things started. Assuming you believe the Big Bang, I know probably most of our listeners don't, but I'm a proponent of it. I think it's interesting to see how the scientists who even come up with like string theory, found the God particle, all that, try to describe that moment, and they all kind of agree that we have no idea what happened before. I forget what they call it, but it's like moment prime or the prime moment or whatever. And it's like, man, yeah,
Yeah.
That's still a
That's
big
why
question.
it's a metaphysical question. Science, as we currently know it, doesn't have the tools to answer that question. It's not a question that we shouldn't ask. It's just that science doesn't give us the tools to answer it, at least now, maybe ever, but at least now.
Not yet.
Um, and so we can speculate. It may be the case that there was just God all alone prior to our universe and absolute nothing but God. Or maybe my theory is correct, or maybe there's been a universe that God didn't create, kind of hanging out. That's not my view, but that's there's a lot of metaphysical options on the table.
Yeah, and I'm gonna. This is my last note. I'm gonna see if Christian has anything else before we move on. But being someone who's a big fan of the immanence of God and the transcendence of God, I kind of believe both sides of that coin.
Sure.
I really like arguments like yours in the sense that I think it kind of refocuses people on the idea that God is in all things. So even if I
Mm,
don't fully agree with everything, I'm like, I do wish there was more of a focus on how God does cooperate with creation and is in all
mm,
things. So that's one
yeah.
thing I really do appreciate about your work, that I think
Good.
it's
Thank
helping
you.
people refocus on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So would you gentlemen say that we've answered the question, why does it matter if people believe in omnipotence or not? Or do you think there's more we need to add to that?
Well, that would be up to the guest.
Well, I'd like to say one more thing about it because I think the strongest criticism of my view is the criticism that if you have a God like mine who's not omnipotent, who is the most powerful, always loving, always acting, but can't control others, then the critic might say to me, okay, what kind of guarantee do we have that everything's going to work out okay at the end? In other words, it's the eschatological question because most traditional theologies have got an omnipotent God, and God can decide to kick butt and send some people to hell and some people to heaven, or everybody to hell or everybody to heaven. God can just up and do whatever. And so we can trust that well, maybe trust is not the right word, but that somehow God will single handedly bring about some conclusion. And I don't have that in my God. However, the God I believe in is relentlessly loving, and that means that I happen to believe in an afterlife. I think God continues to invite all creation to salvation, to a life of love, whatever that looks like, depending on the complexity of the creature. And because God never, ever gives up on anybody or anything, I have the genuine hope that love will eventually win and all things will be reconciled, to use the language of the Apostle Paul. But I don't have that kind of guarantee that can only come from an omnipotent move.
Yeah. I I will say I think that most people, I was going to say most Christians, I think most people need certainty a little bit too much. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I'm with
that's
you.
one of my things with the Bible too. I'm like, I believe the Bible is completely true and it involves stuff of how I live my life and how I interact with God. But I think it can be wrong about any number of other things,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's something that makes a lot of people really uncomfortable.
yeah.
In my view, having a God who is all powerful and loving, that for some reason isn't stopping these things. Yeah, I mean that's, people need that certainty of, well, of knowing why God's doing the things He's doing, and I think for me, I'm like, I don't need that certainty, and I think on your end, there's also that people who desperately need the certainty that God's going to win in the end. I'm like, well, why? Why can't you?
Yeah.
Because I guess to me, if you have certainty, it's not a relationship. I can't have
Mm,
a relationship with the Bible if I'm certain that it's just a handbook. Then
mm,
it's I need to have some level of mystery of uncertainty to have a relationship with someone. If I fully knew Christian would just be boring. I wouldn't have a relationship because I would never talk to him. I know what he's going to say.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. On this issue, if we're just kind of talking about psychology and the need some people have for certainty, I think there's a lot of people who have the need for the security that comes from certainty, and they link it to omnipotence. So if I come along and say God is not omnipotent, now they can't feel secure, now they
Mm-hmm.
can't be certain, and that pulls the rug out from underneath them. And so
Yeah.
they'd rather have the comfort of that certainty and security. Now, usually what happens to those persons is that at some point in their life, they encounter some big question. Their kid dies of cancer, or their spouse cheats on them, or their kid comes out of the closet and they don't know what to think about things, or whatever. Something comes up that makes them rethink the certainty about God that they thought they had. And when those people go through those times, they usually come my direction in the sense of coming to the ways of thinking that I'm proposing here. Because those ways that I'm suggesting, I think, do a better job of handling those big questions. Excuse me.
Yeah, I'd say I prefer certainty. And Josh and I have had this debate several times before because it
Oh
increases
man.
my understanding and my willingness to go along with certain things. And that I prefer, I'm never going to understand every single aspect of God while I'm on this planet. I have to accept that fact as much as it irks me.
Yeah, you have to go to Mars where he's watching with his popcorn.
We're not bringing up Dr. Manhattan here. Yeah, it's
Did you say that certainty helps you learn? Is that what you
no, it
said?
helps my understanding.
Understanding.
Is in like God has allowed all these things to happen. He allowed Adam and Eve to fall, knowing he already had a plan in case things happen this way, knowing they would happen this way, so that eventually when Jesus comes back and those who have repented of their sins and turned to him will be with him for eternity. Like that is certain to me. I don't know steps 1 through 120, but I know there's a step 1 and I know there's a step 120 that helps me establish myself firmly. Like, as I said before, like there's some things I'm never going to know. Like, why did that person have to die? Why can't we just keep existing for however long? And then eventually most of us would, maybe some of us would come to faith later on. Who knows? I'm not God. And that uncertainty does hurt me. But at the end of the day, the certainty of him being who he is what keeps me firm where I'm at.
And what's the basis for your certainty?
What he says and who he is and what he's done.
And how do you know that?
Well, I mean, if we're using examples from our own life, all the times where I've acted against who I am, who I truly am without him, and go, that did not come from me. Because there is
So
no reason.
your experience of something beyond yourself gives you certainty that God exists.
That's part of it. I mean, and you go to with scripture, and I'm an inerrant kind of guy.
Okay.
And I mean, kind of obvious with me. It's like God has over time proven himself over and over to be this love, to be the one who, even despite people acting wicked, being wicked, continues to love them, continues to offer a way out, even knowing they're not going to make that choice. That certainty helps establish me on that cornerstone of like, okay, this is where I am.
Yeah, I think you're like most people who claim to be certain about these things. You have two bases. One, a particular view of scripture that you think you could count on as being without error, and two, a particular assurance of experience that you have no doubts about. And I think that's very common. Now, what usually happens for people to give up certainty is they start doubting that the Bible is error free because they see errors in the Bible. Or they start realizing, I've been wrong about my experience sometimes. How can I be certain about this experience? Um, and then what usually happens, I'm not saying it's going to happen to you, but
Yeah.
what usually happens is people then deconstruct and
Yes.
they go, okay, well, I have got nothing now if I can't be certain of my experience in the Bible. Um, and then after a time of deconstruction, people start saying, okay, well, then how am I going to live my life? How am I going to make any sense of things? And then the kinds of ideas that I propose start making sense to them. Because what I'm proposing isn't just like, you know, I'm just not pulling out of my butt. Like I've got some reasons, I've got some arguments, I've got some data, not proofs, but I've got some a case to be made that sounds attractive to people.
Well, I've gone on record several times on the show at being, and I know how contradictory this statement is. I'm a huge believer in doubt, and that
Okay, well that's weird. Yeah,
every Christian should doubt, if not, I mean, it should be way more than once, but over
yeah.
time, because that has always affirmed my faith at the end of the day. No matter where I was, no matter what I was going through, I had to look into scriptures. What does it say? I mean, thank God I just got done with Hebrew syntax and exegesis. I'm done for the rest of my life. I'll never have to parse another Hebrew verb unless I want to. But now I have a better understanding of the language. Like, what is the original intent here? I can go back. Is it really translated the right way? Is this word, does it actually mean what it says in the original Hebrew and English? Like, I can
Yeah,
do that.
but if you've looked at the scripture, you know that that's not the case, right? I mean, if you looked at the Hebrew, you know that the vowels aren't the same. You know that the word can mean a variety, especially the Hebrew words can mean such a wide variety of things. So it's strange to me that you would have these kind of certainty when you know that the original text have varieties, have different vowel systems, have a range of meanings. So, but I'm not trying to take it
No,
away
no,
from
no.
you. I'm just saying
You're fine.
it's a strange it's a strange thing.
I mean, because at the end of the day, it affirms what I already know, and that God is who He says He is. And humans, I don't think when I say inerrant, I don't mean we have 100% word to word translations of what is originally intended. What I mean is that the words that God spoke to His prophets and to His original writers, we have them today. Now, translated from Hebrew to English, Greek to English, so on and so forth. I don't think we have a one to one all the time. I mean, we've even
Yeah.
talked about that with just the word Almighty here today. But I do, at the end of the day, it's like God protected those words for us despite human intervention.
Mm.
I just want to throw out there, inerrancy is a word that I've come to not necessarily disagree with, but I just kind of avoid it because which might be what happens with omnipotence, because I'm just kind of at this point of like how hard it is for me to explain. Like, if I say I believe in inerrancy, what I mean is specifically the things that deal with this are without error. That's like, you know what? It's just easier to not use the word.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've
But
got a question for you guys because I'm
yeah,
I'm
this is fun.
strongly against inerrancy. I think that's the wrong way to go, and I'm not certain like Christian is, and I'm getting rid of omnipotence. Like it sounds like Joshua wants to keep it. Um, you guys are supposed to be about unity. How do the three of us find unity despite these, I think, pretty significant disagreements? Um, whether or not the Bible has errors, that's split a lot of churches up. Me running around saying God is not omnipotent, that's going to piss a bunch of people off.
Oh man,
Well,
yeah.
So,
I mean,
what
My
is
Big Bang
unity?
thing earlier probably.
oh, yeah.
I mean, this is not like, do you like the Lakers or the Warriors? These are big issues. So, I'm turning to you, not because I've got the answers. What does unity look like when our disagreements are so profound?
I mean, did Jesus Christ save you from yourself?
Yeah, I think you and I have a different view on that. I don't
But
think
I'm fine with
Jesus
that.
saved me for. So I'm just saying that would not be something that unifies us. We'd have different beliefs. I think I have intrinsic value. I'm not perfect, obviously. There's some things I'm trying to change, but I'm not a person who thinks out of self-deny all the time. I think there's certain things about me that are valuable. I suspect you would agree with some of that and probably disagree with others. So like I'm kind of skeptical we could even find a fundamental belief that would unite the three of us. Maybe that there's a God. I believe there's a God. I think you guys do. But
Well, well, okay. So this is me backtracking through our conversations today.
okay.
Um, I have to apologize to Christian. I'm going to kind of ignore the inerrancy thing for a bit.
That's okay.
Okay.
But I really feel like a lot of what you're saying, from what I've read, even it's almost as though you're saying God is infinity minus one powerful, and I'm saying He's infinity powerful, and I'm like, at the end of the day, your God's still pretty similar to mine. Like, it's not quite the same. Like, man, and I think this is a good opportunity to bring up the omnipotence term
Yeah.
too, because I think we probably all would agree on that term in some way. It also sounds like, even though we might disagree on what salvation means, because you seemed a little affirming when I talked about my experience of salvation, that we all probably have that
Yes,
similar experience, do value the Bible, do value God, and do value
I
Jesus.
do.
So there
Yeah.
has to be some overlap, even if it's
Yeah.
not super significant.
Yeah. So if we get really general, we could have
Yeah,
some
yeah, yeah,
unity.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
which
mean,
maybe as good as we can hope for. I'm guessing because, like, you just laid out some problems you have with atonement theories, and I think I have some of the same similar problems. But a lot of other Christians think one or more of those are essential to being a Christian. So they couldn't be on the same page with us on the details there.
Okay, I have a question for all of us now.
Okay.
Because this might answer the other question. We'll see. As a Christian, what is your mission?
I know my answer quickly.
Oh, perfect.
Go for it.
My mission in life is to live a life of love.
Yeah.
Now, I think a lot of Buddhists could say the same thing, so I'm not saying only Christians have that mission, but that's my mission.
Yeah. I think I know I agree with it. I was going to say I think we both would agree with that. I definitely agree with that. Of course, we probably would differ some on what that love means, but I think there's a lot of things when we're out doing the Christian things of showing love that we are probably doing the same things.
Yeah.
I'll say for me, it's I'm here to love God and love my neighbor as myself, and then to make disciples.
Great. I got no problem with that.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Good. Unified.
So maybe the unity is in the mission, and
Yeah,
we'll see on
although,
that practical level.
when we start looking at the details, I just co-edited this book on LGBTQ stuff. There's a whole bunch of people in my denomination who don't think I'm a Christian at all because of my views on queer issues. So
Yeah.
they would say they're loving. I think I'm loving, but what it actually looks like is pretty different when it comes to queer matters.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Here's what I
I
have to say on that: is that when I go to church on Sunday morning, I have put my trust and faith in Jesus Christ. He has saved me from myself, and I have to put my trust and faith that Jesus Christ has done the same thing to the people around me. So I'm never going to know that. I can't see your soul. You can't see mine. All I know is that I have to trust that who Jesus is who he said he was, and that he's done the same mighty work in those who have repented of our sins. So we can get into the details, the nitty gritty of all that, but that's good enough for me.
Yep.
One of my favorite lines ever said on this show wasn't from any of us. I'm sorry, guys, but Reverend. Some of my favorite lines were from you guys too, but one that I really liked, Reverend Justin Coleman was on the show, and he said, and it was funny because he was saying it jokingly, but it really stuck with me. The statement was, "I'm just really glad there's not going to be a theology test when we all get to heaven." And I'm like, yeah. You know
all
what?
God's people said,
yeah,
amen.
Glad about that. I'm glad that God's not going to make me take a test at any point.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
fail.
I mean, I don't think having the right theology is the reason you go to heaven, which, that may seem really obvious to the three of us, but there's a whole lot of Christians who think that you don't have the right set of beliefs. You can't rightly be called a Christian. But what I'm also saying is that even if the three of us think that love is central, we might have some pretty interesting disagreements on what love looks like in particular situations.
Yeah.
And so that matters. I'm not sure exactly how that all plays out in the end, but it matters in the present.
Yeah. We did an episode. We do these roundtables. We have a bunch of people from different traditions come together and kind of just discuss different topics and try to find some unity there. And recently we talked about kind of the difference of unity and uniformity. And
nice.
that was one I really liked, because it's one of those, we don't all have to be on the same page to have unity, to get along in Christ and love and all those things. We don't have to all be the same person, same robotic, formulas, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation. And even like the practical stuff, maybe there's times where, Christian, I'm going to pick on you and
go for it.
Just know that this is an example. So I'm not saying that this is or is not true. But maybe there's times that Tom and I are going out and doing an outreach to those in the LGBTQ community and showing them love. And maybe you're not comfortable doing that. Maybe, and this is also not true, but just for the sake of the thing, maybe I disagree with him and he's affirming of them. And I'm just like, hey, I don't think that that's a good Christian lifestyle, but I want to help them anyway. So I'm comfortable helping in this mission. We're all disagreeing. I'm helping with this mission, and maybe next time we're all three doing the thing together. I think we're able to have unity, even not do all of the same things together without having to be uniform, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's tough. So I'm thinking about your example, and I'm thinking about people in my denomination who say, well, I love queer people. I love my gay neighbor. And they're welcome at my church, but they can't teach our Sunday school class. And they need to repent of their gay lifestyle,
Mm.
but I love them.
Hmm.
Most gay people I know, most queer people I know, that doesn't sound like love to them.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like love at all. So the three of us saying we all love, but we do it in different ways, might not be felt as love by those who were trying to express love too.
Yeah. And I think that's where you get the really practical disagreements of
Yeah.
I think we could have unity within, in this example, us three still, and then maybe Bob, who is, a gay pastor, wouldn't be able to have unity with Christian. He's iffy on me in this example because I made myself, against it, but man, he loves Tom. So there's definitely different degrees of this unity, even in those examples. And man, I would love to get deeper into the LGBTQ conversation, but we're an hour in,
Yeah.
so
We
So
maybe
sure are.
we'll put a pin in it and do another part of this
yeah,
some other time
Cool. Well,
if
I've
Tom's
really
willing to come
enjoyed our.
back.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I've enjoyed our conversation. It's been
very much
fun
so.
having you guys press me and letting me press you back.
Oh yeah, it's always fun when someone smarter than you tells you that you're wrong. I love it. I love it.
Well, speaking of
Love.
all that, like, okay, what would it take for all of us to make a complete 180 on this to change our current stances? I'll go first
On what
because
issue? On
on
omnipotence?
the issue of the definition of how omnipotence is, what it
Oh,
actually
gotcha.
truly is.
Yeah.
For me, I know I've been silly a couple times earlier, but like, I'm not being when I say this. It would literally take God to come down and say, "You have it wrong," for
Huh.
me to flip on this. Because when I look into Scripture, when I look into everything else, I don't see the opposing view completely. Like we've said before, the things I agree with what you're saying, but not wholly. So that's what it would take for me.
My
I
answer. Oh, go ahead.
no, okay. Okay. I guess for me it would be someone would have to explain to me more about God's relation with time to make the jump, more or less. And I think it would be the same thing if I started on your end. I think it's because I already have this belief and experienced God the way I did. I'm just being honest. I have that. This is what I've always believed bias.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I think that would be the one part that would be the biggest hurdle for me. And I know you mentioned you talked about time in this book. So maybe I need to read that and re-examine myself and just kind of think about it. But I think that's the big thing for me is just kind of to throw the time wrench in it all. I think depending on how God relates to time and stuff, there's a problem with all of these views, right? If we're saying that God could, if we're just going to put him in our time zone, before he raped somebody, a guy raped somebody, sorry, not God, before a guy rapes someone, God could have just immediately sent him to hell. Well, that kind of gets into this. Well, he judged someone before they did something thing. Did he know the future? What's going on there? Why, if he's able to stop it in the moment, well, then, yeah, he should absolutely stop it. If he's just afterwards sending him to hell, well, from us, why didn't you do it beforehand? And then, there's all these things that are issues that to me could be resolved if I had a better understanding or grasp on time itself and how God relates to it.
Okay, good. For those who are listening or watching, I addressed those issues in very plain English in a book called Open and Relational Theology. God's relation to time is a big part of that book. But back to the question. My answer would be similar to Christians on this. You would have to take some sort of experience of omnipotence for me to change my mind. And as soon as I say that, I realize to myself, I've never experienced an omnipotent move of God. And as far as I know, nobody in their entire universe has ever experienced that. At least by that, I mean, you talk about your salvation, Joshua. That seems, I have a hard time believing that was an omnipotent move by God's part because you had some sort of, it seemed like you were live. You were
Yeah.
probably responding in some way. You were saying yes in some way. So the very fact that it would take an omnipotent move by God to make me change my mind about omnipotence, and that I've never ever witnessed that, gives actually more support to my view that God's not omnipotent. But it could happen. Who knows?
Yeah. I another fun wrench in there. I would argue, I think logically, the only way someone could experience omnipotence is by being omnipotent. So,
Maybe so. Yeah.
Like,
So
I think you
in
have
that
to have the
case,
ability to feel all power. And I think the only way to be able to feel all power is if you have all power. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to contain that much power.
yeah. One of the arguments I look at in this book is that the notion of an isolated God who's omnipotent makes no sense because power is a relational concept. You can only
Hmm.
think about power in relation to something else. But if God is all alone, there's nothing else to be related to, and therefore God can't be omnipotent if omnipotent is a
Hmm.
relational word.
Yeah.
So, anyway, getting nerdy again. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, I love it. I could do this forever. I'm going to do a director's move right here. Director's note. Christian, after
Yes.
this, jump to the God moment. I want to throw out first, because we mentioned it a lot. The title of the book, Death of Omnipotence, The Birth of Omnipotence. Omnipotence. I don't know how to say that word clearly. Um, but we talked a lot about differing ideas about omnipotence. There's another part of that book that I think, mentioning unity and stuff, I think that might be the part that would get us to come together a little bit more, as I like this idea of omnipotence. Um,
Yeah. The
could
power of
you,
love.
yeah, could
Ami
you
being
just explain it?
love.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ami being love, potence being power. So I coined this word amipotence to replace omnipotence. A good number of theologians have said God is both omnipotent and loving. And in this last chapter, I argue that they eventually undermine their own arguments when they try to say the two are equal. I think you have to make one have a priority, and most have ended up putting power before love. So I propose what it would look like if we put the primacy of uncontrolling love first. What would God's power look like? And I think you still have a maximally powerful God, but a God who can't control others because this God is a loving God.
Yeah. And I just watched too many Disney movies. I think love is all powerful.
I love
That's where I
it.
get my theology from.
That being noted, that being said, guys, check out the trailer for Disney's Wish. This episode is sponsored by. No, I
Yeah,
would
you
be
wish.
in a much bigger house if this episode was sponsored by. Oh man,
Are we good for our God moment?
yeah.
All right. So before we wrap up, we just want to ask everyone to share a moment that they last saw God, kind of recently, whether that be kind of some kind of a blessing, a challenge, or whatever just happened. So we always make Joshua go first, if I'm remembering my lore correctly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So go for it, Josh.
Man, there's a lot, and I'm trying to think of a good one, and I'm stalling. I'm gonna say my dog. he he is there's a lot of different ways, but recently, I went away for the weekend, and just I had a lot of fun being away from him because I was with my friends and all that, and yet because I was at a friend's house and we were just kind of doing normal life stuff, didn't come for any cool event or anything. It did feel like something was missing when it was time to go to bed. I'm like, well, where's the dog? When it's time to eat, I'm like, well, where's my buddy at? Then when I get home, it's like, things felt right again. And just kind of remembering that difference that God makes in my life too. Of like, there are these moments where I'm plugged in better and life seems to make more sense, feel more right, as opposed to when, I haven't been interacting as much. So just kind of this reminder of some things are just that fundamentally part of my life. And I'm thankful that God and my dog are that way.
Well, I'm going to cheat twice. And then again, as I always do, because one of these will be an event that hasn't happened yet, which wasn't an option that we read earlier. But my first one is actually going to be more serious in that two friends of ours, Jenny and Dino, recently had some issues with the pregnancy. And as a result of that, there was a huge talk of whether or not this baby would live. Very scared about that. They were doctors were saying like there's nothing that could be done. We had a lot of people praying over that issue, and I believe that God intervened on their behalf because from what the doctors were saying, like you should just make your peace with this, and then they're not out of the woods. I'm not going to say that, but it is far more positive now than when it was. And I'm very grateful for that, for them, for that whole family. So my God moment there is seeing his his power manifest in that moment. And I'm not trying to like get some extra last word on that subject. I do mean that legitimately. And my second is the future one that hasn't happened yet, of course, and that I will be getting to meet everyone in person that is going to be attending the conference. And I am really excited for it. Like, I can't even put it into words just how great that's going to be for me to meet these people that I have loved from afar. And Josh, sometimes a little too close to you for my own good, especially with the room we're going to be having together. You know what? It's okay. I love it. I'm ready for it. That's my God moments. Tom?
He might take that one back once he realizes how truly tragic his defeat was at Killer Bunnies and the Quest for the Magical Carrot. But
well, if that's the case, I'll list a retraction on the Let Nothing Move You podcast.
There we go.
I attended church. Excuse me. I attended church in which one of the former pastors would talk about God moments. And I didn't like the phrase initially for two reasons. One, I thought to myself, a God moment sounds like this is a moment in which God alone does something, omnipotence, and there's no other creaturely forces and factors. This is obviously God did it. And I thought, I don't think that ever happens to anybody ever. So there can't be any God moments if it's just God all alone. And then I thought to myself, well, that's not the way I see reality. Um, Now, another way to think of God moments is to say that all of your or most of your life is creaturely moments, and then God has to jump in every once in a while. And that's the God moment. But I don't like that view because that means that God's not always present to us, not omnipresent. So I've come to think of God moments as every moment is a potential God moment because God is always with us, always acting, always influencing. But some moments, creatures respond in unique and ways to God, in powerful ways to God. And in those moments, even though God's present every single moment, those moments are more dramatically reflective of God's love. So, in light of that, God moment for me, spending time with my grandkids this weekend.
Nice. Ironically, for those listening, this is what it's like with if TJ would ever explain how he uses some of his words, because that's basically what he believes. And if you listen to TJ say the God moment, he always says a moment in which you particularly saw or felt God.
Okay, nice.
And it's really funny because that's why he used to always pick really small things that people were like, well, that didn't have anything to do with God at all. And he's like, didn't it? He did that for a long time.
I love it. Yeah.
Oh,
good.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening for this. Please, if you feel led to, help us out with our Patreon for the whole church. And there's some bonus content you get there, like our pet peeve segment as well. Don't know if we're doing that for this episode in particular, but there's some pretty good ones so far. As well, we have a ton of shows on the channel for AMP. Go ahead and check them out. Josh?
Yeah. On the Apple podcast, you could also, there will be a subscription channel. So all of our bonus content for Patreon will be on there, as well as bonus content for some of the other shows. I know for my other show that I mentioned earlier, Dummy for Theology, I'm going to once a month just go through my little pocket dictionary of theological terms and just pick a term to talk about once a month. So that'll be fun. And of course, if you want to see the other shows without paying for anything, just see what the shows are, there's a link down below in the show notes for the Amazon Ministries Podcast Network, AMP Network, if you will. It has its own link, so you can see all the shows in the network in one spot.
All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed the show. Had a really fun time discussing this with Tom today. Like a really fun time. Very rewarding.
Great time.
So come back next week where I won't be here unless Josh has to pull another audible. And I have like 2 hours of preparation instead of 3 this time around. Who knows? That's the fun. So we will be interviewing, by we I mean them, Josh Patterson about his podcast, Rethinking Faith. After that, they'll have a couple of live recordings for the upcoming convention we're going to be having. We've been jazzing up this whole time. You got to come. After that, Don, is it Coke?
Yes.
Dan Koch of the You Have Permission podcast will be joining us. And then finally, at the end of season 1, Francis Chan will be joining us if he knows what's good for him.
Yeah. He hasn't been made aware yet, but when he does, the fear of a potentially omnipotent potent and maybe not omnipotent God will be struck into him, and he will show up on the show.
I actually criticized Francis Chan in this new book, so
Perfect. Ironically, I think we have had quite a few people who've criticized Francis Chan on, and a few people that I know that he has problems with, and I'm like, deal with it, Francis. You're coming on anyway.
I love it.
It's his turn to defend himself.
Yeah.